you on? We're recording?
Yep, we're recording.
Perfect. Then I can edit stuff out.
Take a look.
Should be that good. Looks good.
Hi, everybody. I always say thank you for coming, but oh my goodness, are you troopers today? This weather needs to end, and it's not going to very soon. Same old for everybody who comes every week. Book Sandwiched In is a program of the Friends of the Library. The Friends support our public library to a great degree with proceeds from their book sale. If you're not a member or haven't re-upped for this year, please do so at the table. Hazel and Kristen are there to take your $5, or if you're a family, $15. It's a real bargain. As most of you already know, we're gearing up for Library Advocacy Day. Sorry, I'm tired today. In Albany, next Tuesday. Once again, the governor has cut library funding in her budget. So if you see those email opportunities to put in your 2 cents going around or see it on social media, please take the opportunity. It takes about 20 seconds. We count on our legislators to push back on that. Unfortunately, we usually just get things restored to what they were the year before. Libraries are seriously underfunded in New York State. So any time you can reach out to your legislators and to the governor's office, terrific. If you haven't done an advocacy postcard, they're at the end of the counter here. If you could sign one and leave it here, we'll be delivering those in Albany. That would be terrific. They're also at the library if you forget to do it today. I think everybody's helped themselves to refreshments. Take your chair to the rack at the end, all except 12. That's always a little bit of a chore at the end. Today's book is Wild Thing, A Life of Paul Gaugin by Sue Prideaux. There are 2 print copies in the library system. The ebook and the audiobook are both available through the Libby app. And the audiobook is available with no wait via Hoopla, and it's a pretty good narration. Of course, you don't get to see the pictures, so you're going to want to also get the hardcover. Today's presenter is Dr. Katherine Fultz. Katherine is a visual anthropologist, illustrator, and educator for early childhood and family programs at the Rockwell Museum. She holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Michigan, for which she conducted 3 years of field research in Guatemala. Part of this research included teaching photography workshops to indigenous Maya youth and adults alongside her own ethnographic photography practice. She's been immersed in thinking about visual art and communication for the better part of 20 years and is fascinated by how humans use imagery to shape the world around them. Thanks for joining us, Katherine.
Thank you all so much for being here today. Like we said, I know it's freezing out, so I really appreciate you making the effort. Thank you so much to the Friends of the Library for the invitation to be here. I was really thrilled to be asked to review this book. And thank you very, very much to Card Carrying for the lovely hardback edition of the book. If you can get your hands on the print copy, it is worth it to see the images printed. The ebook version also has the images, so that's great, but I feel like to understand this story, you really do need to see the artwork. One of the things that I think the author does such a beautiful job of is tying the artwork into the narrative and kind of building the narrative from there. So definitely worth getting a print edition of it. That said, I'm just going to cut right to the chase. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really fun. I don't usually read biographies, to be honest, but I feel like this book was everything you would want in a biography. I was also told that I should ask, how many of you also read the book? Oh, excellent. Okay. There's nothing worse, I think, than a biography about a nice person, because it's really boring. This is not that. And so Prideaux does a really beautiful job of building excitement and adventure and quite a lot of conflict into the life of Gaugin, and also bringing in his artwork and showing how all of these things are intermeshed together. It was meticulously researched and incredibly detailed, and it had, like I said, wonderful, wonderful visuals. In addition to that, I went down way too many rabbit holes as I was reading, so it took me twice as long to read as it should have. But you might find that too. So in this presentation, I've provided a slide with further reading suggestions so you can benefit from my rabbit holes. I'm happy to share that at the end. But just in case you are like my husband and you said, who's Gaugin? Which is no shade to him because he's a really smart guy. He just did not study art history. That's totally fine. Gaugin is a French painter. He lived from 1848 to 1903. He was also a sculptor and a carver and a printmaker and all of these other things he wrote. He wrote editorials, he wrote books, he wrote pamphlets. He was very wide-ranging in the types of creation he engaged in. He was generally associated with post-impressionism and beyond that, the primitivist and synthesist schools or sub-schools of post-impressionism. So he was hanging out with all of the famous French impressionists that we know, like Monet and Degas, and then he was thinking about how do we advance that artwork beyond what they have established. However, he's perhaps most infamous for spreading syphilis around the South Pacific, calling his subjects savages, and perhaps worst of all, marrying 13-year-old girls, and yes, that is plural. I'm being a little flippant here, and I don't mean to be dismissive. This is obviously a horrific legacy to leave, aside from the artwork. But I think that these things are a large reason that this book exists in the first place. And we're not going to ignore them, but I do want to pin them for a moment so we can talk specifically about the book. He was, incidentally, incredibly well-traveled, in spite of the fact that he was pretty much reliant on his friends and extended family for money throughout his entire adulthood. He spent his childhood in Peru, or at least the first 7 years of it. When he came back to France and completed his education, he joined the Merchant Marine, which allowed him to go all around the world and get paid for it, luckily. He spent a little bit of time in India as part of the Merchant Marine. And then after he failed out of being a stockbroker, he moved with his wife's family to Denmark for a time. From there, he went back to Breton, France. He spent some time in Panama and Martinique. And then finally, of course, French Polynesia. This map is not mine, I should say that too, but it is very helpful. So as you're reading, if you can get it at nationalgallery.org.uk, that might be a helpful resource to have. We'll be referring back to this as I go through the presentation as well. So he was very well traveled. He used his travels to really fuel his artwork. But what I would really like to talk about is the big questions that this book seeks to answer, or at least engage with, in addition to this amazing, crazy life that Gaugin had. And for me, I think that it is really trying to engage with two big questions. And the first is, can we enjoy art without knowing its social context? And I think that the existence of this book is an answer, and that answer is no. Because why would you read this book if you were not interested in the social context of the art of Gauguin? And I think for Prideaux also, that is the answer, that you must understand the social context that all of these works rise out of in order to enjoy them and appreciate them. For me personally, speaking as an anthropologist, but also as just kind of a general nerd, context is possibly the most important thing and interesting thing for me when I'm looking at a piece of art. I really want to know, what stories did this piece grow out of? What stories is it trying to tell? And Prideaux does a beautiful job of kind of building layers of social context around Gauguin's artwork. The second big question, then, of course, can we enjoy art in spite of the social context, especially a context like this, where we know Gauguin's legacy was less than stellar? And again, I think that the answer presented by this book, at least, is no. The reason this book exists is because Sue Prideaux loved Gauguin's artwork, and she knew this legacy that surrounded him of being this basically colonial predator in the South Pacific. And she wanted to do research into his life to help make this legacy more complex, to shed light on him as a human being and not as a historical caricature. And she is quoted in several news pieces about this book as really wanting to enjoy his artwork still, even knowing he is a monster and not being able to do that. And so that's what kind of sent her down her own rabbit holes of research and investigation. So these are interesting questions, I think, especially recently, and especially in light of things like the Me Too movement. And I'm taking this heading from an essay and a book written by Claire Detterer in 2016. I've linked it in the additional resources slide if you'd like to read it. It had a bit of a viral moment. She was engaging in a takedown, really, of Woody Allen. But in her book, she also talks about Gauguin. And it's this debate over what to do with the art of quote-unquote monstrous men like Gauguin. The debate has been really important for a lot of people, especially recently. And I want to pause just for a moment before getting further into the book to think about why that is. Why do we care? Why does it matter what we do with the art of monstrous men? And that's not a flippant question, that's a real question. Why do we care so much? Because we do. This book wouldn't exist, I think, if we didn't care. And I'm going to get into my anthropology nerd talk for a minute and talk a little bit about what I think is really at the root of this is human nature. And I know that's like a really big claim, that we think that that humans really love to make categories. We do that in order to make sense of the world. We want to file things away, and we want everything to be nice and neat, and we especially love binaries. We like to be able to look at things and say, yep, that's good, yep, that's bad, now I know which evil person to avoid and which good person to go towards. But unfortunately, that leaves a lot of gray area, and it erases a lot of complexity, because we know also human beings are messy, and we are irrational, and we are not all universally good or universally bad. But it's a lot easier for our brains, for social engagement, and for life in general, if we can try at least to engage in that. If somebody has done great, amazing work that we love to look at and has had influence on generations and generations of subsequent artists like Gauguin has, it's a lot harder for us to learn then that they were actually a big creep, because that puts them in a gray zone. It puts them in between the categories of good and bad, and we go, I don't know what to do with that. The other question we have to ask when we're looking at the art of monstrous men, of course, is who is benefiting from their work? And Gaugin is long dead. He died 123 years ago, but there are still people benefiting from his bad behavior. Namely, his influence on art, the way that artists still reference his work and draw on his work. Western perceptions of Tahiti. I came across, as I was doing research for this, the most fascinating ad for tourism in Tahiti. Oh my gosh, fascinating and also a little horrifying, I have to say. Luckily, the ad itself was from 1995, so I felt a little bit like, okay, maybe things have changed a little bit. But then I went and I discovered there's a whole cruise line dedicated to visiting the sites that Gaugin lived at in Tahiti and elsewhere in French Polynesia, and like showing his hut is a tourist location, where he was painting his subjects. All of this stuff is part of like a tour industry that you can still go and enjoy even today. So there are people making money off of his legacy even now. And of course, how we think about people in Tahiti has been greatly shaped by his depictions of them, for better or for worse. So, you gotta follow the money in that case, right? And then finally, I think a lot of our concern over the art with monstrous men might actually be related to something aspirational on our parts. We see something great that a human being has created, and we go, oh my gosh, that is so cool. I want to make something like that. I can be a great human being too. And then we learn that they were not so great in other areas, and we're going, oh no, but not like that. Like, I don't want to be like him if it means being this horrible person on top of it. So I want to keep these things in mind, kind of these tendencies that human beings have as we look both at Gauguin's art and at his life and think about how Prideaux is presenting them all to us. See which one maybe you find yourself engaging in as you look at this. So that brings me to this question of why write this book and why write it now? It's the first book that has been written about Gaugin in the last 30 years, so it's kind of odd that somebody became interested in him again after all of this time. There was a confluence of several events beginning in the year 2000. The first was a discovery of 4 teeth. And Prideaux opens with this little anecdote in the book. They were the mayor of the town where he lived in Hivaoa, which was the second island he lived on, was excavating where his hut used to be because he wanted to build a new tourist location. And they discovered 4 teeth in a jar in a well, which is just very perplexing. I think even speaking from an archaeological standpoint, like 4 teeth in a glass jar, this is weird. So they sent it off to Cambridge for genetic analysis, and it was part of the Human Genome Project. They were able to analyze it alongside the teeth or the DNA evidence of one of Gauguin's grandchildren, and 99% certainty that yes, they belonged to Gaugin. So then they were like, hey, we can learn a lot about people from their teeth. Let's send this off to the Field Museum in Chicago. And they did an analysis for heavy metals because treatment for syphilis causes heavy metals to show up in your teeth. And they found no heavy metals in his teeth. They're like, oh my gosh, he was not treated for syphilis. That's weird, because we know he had a doctor, we know he was receiving treatment for something, but apparently it was not syphilis. And if that's not true about him, what else might not be true? Around 2019, there was an exhibition of his portraits at the National Gallery in London. And honestly, I feel like saying, guys, portraits of Gaugin, really? What were you thinking? Because the majority of his portraits were painted while he was living in Tahiti, and the majority of his portraits were of nude underage girls. 2019, me too, really, this was kind of a curatorial mistake, if you ask me. It received really horrible reviews, like just terrible reviews. And it brought people like Mette Gaugin, who is his great-granddaughter, out of the woodwork. And this was really the impetus for Prideaux writing this book. She was like, well, the art's beautiful, but obviously the guy is horrible, so what can I do about this? And the granddaughter reached out to her. The rest is history, because in addition to the teeth and the exhibition, the great-granddaughter gave her an untranslated, unpublished family memoir written by Gauguin's youngest son, Pola, which is super exciting because it was in Norwegian, and Sue Prideaux's first language was Norwegian, which I think is just like this amazing confluence of coincidences. It also happens that Sue Prideaux has built a bit of a reputation for herself writing biographies of difficult men, and so she seemed extremely well positioned to take on this project and all of this research. Then in 2020, as if that all wasn't enough, his handwritten manuscript of his memoir reemerged, Avant et Après. He had written this in the last 3 years of his life while living in French Polynesia, and it really called into question his own mindset while living in French Polynesia. We see not Gauguin the colonizer, but rather Gauguin the advocate. And it turns out he spent a great deal of the last 3 years of his life in court, both for his own trials after insulting a French police officer, and then also on behalf of his neighbors who were trying to fight the separation of their children being kidnapped and taken to boarding school. And so he really served as an advocate for all of these people he had been living with. And then finally, the cherry on top of all of that, in 2021, his catalogue raisonné was published, and that is the comprehensive, authoritative record of all of his artwork, and kind of the curatorial explanation and exploration of it. So all of these things are kind of circulating in the ether for Sue Prideaux to pull from and to generate a new biography that is quite different from anything that had been written 30 years before. How am I doing on time, just out of curiosity?
We're getting 4 minutes at least.
Oh, beautiful, okay. I was looking at the timer here that says 30 minutes, and I thought, oh no, I can't be taking that long. So we have a little bit of background on how the book came to be, the sort of questions I think the book is trying to answer, why I thought it was interesting. Now I think it would be helpful if we take a look at the art that Prideaux chose to include in the text. Like I said before, she does a beautiful job of not just like signposting the art, but bringing it into the narrative and explaining exactly what role this art played at very particular points in Gauguin's life. So we're going to do some audience choice. These are 8 artworks that I selected from the book. Certainly not all of the artworks that are featured in the book. But I think that they are representative of a variety of points in Gauguin's life and will give us a nice little window into tidbits that Prideaux, or into tidbits of what Prideaux provides for us. I've got like 8 pages of notes here, so we're not going to get through all of it, and I wouldn't want to impose that on you. But hopefully for those of you who haven't read the book, this will give you a little bit of a taste and motivation to go and explore, because Prideaux really does discuss these things in much greater detail than I will be able to here. I think I mentioned earlier, it almost reads like a soap opera. So these are little windows into the soap opera that was Gauguin's life. So please feel free to raise your hand or shout out which artwork you would like to start with. The self-portrait. Oh, thank you. That's actually my favorite little story here. So, Gauguin was really close friends with Van Gogh. And oh my goodness, this is the most soap operatic of the stories in the book. It was really, really wonderful to read, engaging to read, but also just horrifying to read. So Gauguin had been spending quite a bit of time in Breton, painting, getting to know other artists, making connections. He met Theo Van Gogh, who was Van Gogh's younger brother and on-again, off-again caretaker, and Theo became his agent. He had also met Vincent, and they became friends, and they started exchanging letters and artwork. And at a certain point, Vincent was like, hey, I want to start an artist colony in the south of France. We're going to lead it, we're going to have disciples, we're going to spread our ideas about Impressionism and Post-Impressionism to the art world. Come and join me. And Gauguin is like, I'm not really sure I want to commit to that. That sounds like a lot. But he was short on cash, and Theo said, if you go and you hang out with my brother, I will pay you 150 francs a week to support you. And if that's not motivation, I don't know what was. So Gauguin travels to the south of France to join Vincent, and he finds when he arrives, oops, there we go. He finds when he arrives his room, which is attached to Vincent's room, filled with giant canvases of sunflowers. So in this sort of manic frenzy leading up to Gauguin's arrival, Vincent was so excited that he painted his sunflower series, at least the second part of his sunflower series, as a welcoming gift. And he wrote to his brother Theo saying, it's going to be this big, beautiful bouquet to welcome my new friend. I know, like, sweet, right? Like, very sweet, but also imagine walking into what was likely a very tiny room and having it filled with these giant canvases and like, oh, what have I gotten myself into? He also discovered, I thought this detail was just amazing, 12 chairs that Vincent had gone and purchased in preparation for the 12 art disciples that they were going to recruit. And so I'm sure at this point Gauguin is getting really, really nervous, but he sticks it out for 9 weeks, and they have a very productive exchange of art and ideas. One of the key exchanges was self-portraiture. So actually Vincent van Gogh did this with several artists. He would send them a self-portrait and they would send him one back. And these are the two portraits that Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh exchanged. So Gauguin you see in this one, likely located in the south of France with the yellow background. He painted their mutual friend Émile Bernard up in the corner there. And then the writing is a line from Les Miserables. He is really like positioning himself as Jean Valjean, the hero, the put-upon hero in this. And you can kind of see from his glower too what he thinks of himself, especially in relation to this whole situation that he's in. Van Gogh, on the other hand, paints himself as this quite ascetic-looking monk, and sends this off to him. So, and I also find it ironic now that the Van Gogh portrait is housed at Harvard, while the Gauguin portrait is housed at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. I think that's kind of funny. But they would paint alongside each other too, and often enjoyed the same subject matter. So these are two different takes here on the Night Cafe. So we've likely seen the one by Van Gogh, maybe you've also seen the one by Gauguin. But they would spend many, many nights here hanging out at this cafe, eating, drinking, socializing, and it was frequently a subject in their mutual artwork. But you can really see the stylistic differences here as well. So Gauguin is known, especially beginning in this period and on through his Tahitian period, for trying to depict the synthesis of dream life and real life. And you see this kind of smoke moving through the background, creating a mysterious atmosphere, and the red background, while that was likely the color of the walls there, it also symbolizes the space of the sacred. Kind of an interesting comparison here. And then finally, did anybody else know, does anybody know that Gauguin was the impetus for Van Gogh cutting his ear off? Yes. So you knew that, yes. So
The movie.
towards the end of 9 weeks. Oh, from the movie.
Lust for Life?
Oh,
Yeah.
I had not seen that movie. Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. So towards the end of 9 weeks, things are wearing thin for Gauguin. Poor Vincent, he is starting to spiral, increasingly manic, increasingly unstable, and clearly in need of more support than Gauguin can offer. he says, or he tells Vincent, I need to head back to Paris. Like, I have to leave. And Vincent flips out. He loses it, gets mad at Gaugin, throws him out. Gaugin goes out to a restaurant, spends the evening there eating and drinking, and on his way home encounters Vincent van Gogh in the street, and he's threatening him with a razor. And he's like, okay, no more of this. And he goes and he stays in a hotel. Comes back to gather his things the following morning, and the police think that Vincent van Gogh is dead. There is so much blood everywhere, and he is unresponsive. Luckily for Gaugin, who is on the brink of being accused of his friend's murder, he's able to rouse Vincent, but they find that he has, in fact, mutilated his own ear, and that's really the end of the story. Gaugin goes back to Paris, but oddly enough, he maintains this friendship with Vincent van Gogh up until his death, up until Vincent van Gogh's death. And they continue to exchange letters and artwork. And one of the really interesting comparisons, this one is not included in the book, but I thought it was striking nonetheless. Here is a fairly well-known self-portrait of Vincent with his ear bandaged, yes, painted in 1889. Here is a ceramic self-portrait that Gaugin produced in the same year. So we'll talk a little bit later about influences specifically on Gauguin's ceramics, but this is the face as jug is very clearly drawn from Peruvian ceramics that he was exposed to as a child. But what's interesting here is the bandage around his face and the way that the glaze kind of gives the impression of dripping from around the ears. The bandage certainly was deliberate. The glaze might have just been a happy accident, but a really interesting parallel alongside his friend's self-portrait with the bandaged ear as well. So that was Gaugin and Van Gogh. All right, another one, another taker.
The lower left?
The lower left, this one?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is from Gauguin's time in Panama and Martinique. So I felt like the book did a really beautiful job of demonstrating how the outcomes of Gauguin's life were a combination, really, of bad luck and exceedingly poor life choices. I mean, you can really see how things kind of all tie together in the end. And I think Panama, especially, was a combination of bad luck and poor life choices. So he's unable to get a job in Paris after the stock market crash in 1882. So he goes to his sister and he says, help. And she says, well, my husband is working in Panama. He's starting a bank to support the construction of the Panama Canal. And wouldn't it be great if he had somebody with your financial expertise to help him out? Because he had been a stockbroker earlier in his life. And so he's like, this sounds great. It's a chance to, make some quick cash getting back into finance. So he goes to Panama to work with his brother-in-law on the Panama Canal. Unfortunately, he gets there. And he learns that it is not a bank that his brother-in-law is opening. It is a general store. And in fact, it is a failing general store, not doing well at all. So they have a falling out pretty much immediately. And he, instead of working in a bank, spends 2 quite doomed weeks helping to dig the Panama Canal. Very, very bad choice because France has been trying to dig the Panama Canal for quite a while at this point. It has been beset by landslides and malaria, and I think I saw a number along the lines of 20,000 deaths. I mean, a horrible, doomed project. And 2 weeks into his dig, the Panama Canal Company collapsed. So, on top of that, he also contracted malaria and dysentery at the same time. He decides instead to travel to Martinique. And try his luck there at painting, especially. He's not traveling alone, he's with his friend Charles Laval. And he's thinking, Panama was a bust, but Martinique, I've heard that this is the place to see beautiful, primitive, unadulterated culture, and that's what I want to paint, is this pure culture. And he was really preoccupied with that. beginning before he even traveled to Panama, but especially through the remainder of his career, finding that quote-unquote pure culture to depict. But he found it too colonialized. At this point, Martinique it's an overseas department of France. It is French. The capital, Fort-de-France, looks like a European city, and that was not acceptable to Gauguin. He was trying to escape that. And so he moves into a hut on the beach with his friend Laval, and he's living on 1.5 francs a day, which is not very much at all. It wouldn't be much now, it certainly wasn't a lot then. And he has malaria and dysentery, again, at the same time. So he's in and out of delirium, Laval is in and out of delirium, but still somehow he manages to paint this, which is a scene from the beach near his hut. He and Laval were able to go down to where the fishmongers would sell fish and where the fruit sellers were working to practice sketching and painting regularly. And he says that this was among the clearest painting of his life in his memoirs. That his time in Martinique, despite again the simultaneous infection with malaria and dysentery, the best artwork he felt that he was turning out. So, after a couple of months there, I think it was like 4 months, he got word from France. He was quite tired at that point of sleeping on beds of seaweed and not having enough to eat and being genuinely sick. He got word from France from his agent that somebody was interested in contracting him to produce ceramics, and he begged, borrowed, and stole his way back to Paris. It really is unclear how he managed to get passage because his supporters back home were not able to send it in time. But he did get back. Of course, when he got there, there was no more ceramic job, so that kind of launched him into the next chapter of his life. Combination of bad luck and bad choices, truly.
So that period of time was before the period of time when he knew Van Gogh, right?
Yeah, so these artworks are in chronological order. Yes, so the earliest one is up here, and then this is his time in Tahiti down here. I was hoping to kind of jump around so that we could like piece together his life without, I should say Prideaux does a strictly chronological treatment of the life with like little vignettes that she inserts throughout from other sources or from like his memories of childhood, and it creates an interesting flow to the narrative. Would we like to pick another one?
You pick.
Me pick? Oh, how about you pick?
What I'm wondering is, you said about being binary. Was he an evil man or was he a broken man?
That's a good question. I mean, I tend to not put people strictly into the good or evil category, and so I think that
I'm
the
not even
answer
sure
would
what
be
evil
broken.
means.
Well, I think broken. I think he was complicated, for sure. And we can talk a little bit about his time in Peru. So why don't we go with this one next? His parents moved him to Peru when he was 18 months old, and his dad died en route. His dad's body actually was recently exhumed from his burial in Tierra del Fuego, which I thought was very interesting. But he and his mom and his sister then spent 7 years with his mother's family in Peru. They would go back and forth between Lima and kind of the family estate further into the mountains. And the whole reason for them being there was his mother trying to claim an inheritance that she felt she was due. Her father had been Peruvian, and his family had jilted her side out of it. 7 years there, she was trying to recoup this inheritance. And Gauguin, meanwhile, was pretty much just running free. He, in his memoirs, has these incredibly idyllic, dreamlike memories of his time there. And of course, no reflection at all on how his family's enslavement of people was enabling this incredibly free and carefree life. But he idolized this in his memory as the perfect place, the perfect way to live. And so he really spent the rest of his life trying to reclaim that. He went back to Lima briefly as an adult, but did not try to seek out his family members. And Prideaux doesn't really provide an explanation, but I wonder if his mother's failure to claim this inheritance caused such a rift that he knew his memories weren't real, and he didn't want to confirm that. He didn't want to go back and see this idyllic location from childhood broken. And instead, he continued to travel repeatedly in search of finding a new paradise to live in and to represent in his art. So his pottery here really speaks to the influence of his time in Peru, especially his mother's collection of mochi pottery. So this is a vessel that Gaugin made in 1886, and I love, he liked geese a lot. Like, he had this particular infatuation with geese. And you see them especially on his ceramics, but here's a goose right there. And here are some mochi pottery samples, not necessarily from his mother's collection, which she did, by the way, succeed in bringing back to France. And the sale of the pottery repeatedly over the years helped to support the family as she was getting set back up there. But Peru, the Peru of his mind, loomed so large in his history that I think it really drove everything else that he ended up doing in his career. Any other
Go to the
requests?
first one.
The first one! This is his earliest piece. Yes. So this is a bust of Emile, his oldest son. And it's notable that it's on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and their tombstone label spells Emile with an E, but according to Prideaux, he spent hours in the registrar's office in France trying to argue that it should be spelled without an E, the Dutch way, or the Danish way. So I wrote it here without the E, just, to reflect that. But in the late 70s and the early 1880s, he was working as a stockbroker in Paris. Shockingly, he had not made any art up to this point in his life, so he was in his mid to late 30s then. And his mother's former love interest, she was the mistress, after her death, he set Gaugin up with this job on the stock market. And he was actually wildly successful. So he did quite well for himself. He was earning upwards of 30,000 francs a year, which is hard to translate into today's currency because of all of the changes in currency we've had since then. But estimates that I've seen put it at around $500,000 a year. Like, that's quite good. Good for you, Gaugin. I love that his level of success was measured in the book by the number of pants that he owned. So he owned more than a dozen pairs of pants, and he flaunted this. He loved people to know how successful he was. In fact, he had been living with his family in the financial district, like the nice part of town where all of his colleagues would have been living, and he didn't like that. So he moved them all to the artsy part of town where all of the studios were located. And you can imagine this was not as nice of a neighborhood. But he would take a taxi to work every day instead of, I don't know what other options existed then, public transportation, a carriage, something. But he would leave the taxi waiting for him outside his office while he worked. Just this exorbitant cost, spending money just left and right. He is pretty much throwing it away. But he's working, he's starting to show a little bit of interest in art at this point, and it was his wife's pregnancy with their first child, Emile, that seemed to spark this sudden creative outpouring for him. And he began sketching, he began painting a little bit, and he developed a really strong interest in sculpture. And that was the real reason he wanted to live in the artsy part of town, because that's where all the sculptors were located. So he was there hanging out with impressionists, He had been introduced to these folks also by the same family friend that set him up as a stockbroker, and he's learning to sculpt. And this is one of the sculptures he produced. He also produced a bust of his wife. The interesting thing about this one, because of his friendship with all these Impressionists, he was invited to participate in the 4th Impressionist exposition in Paris. He didn't have any paintings that he felt were up to snuff at that point, so he submitted this very sweet little bust. But of course, this bust looks like something that could have been, dug out of a pit in Rome. It's extremely classical. On top of that, it is the only sculpture included in the exposition. So if you can imagine, this little bust was alongside paintings like this one by Monet, which is the Garden at St. Andres. This one by Mary Cassatt, American Impressionist, woman with a pearl necklace and a loge. And this very famous one, Gustave Caillebotte, Paris Street, Rainy Day. But it stuck out like a sore thumb. In other words, the real irony.
Isn't art supposed to stick out like a sore thumb?
That is a fair argument, yes, and it served him well. Working as a hobbyist. So we could talk about his family if you'd like, since we were just talking about the son. Yeah.
One last question.
Sure.
When I look at a piece of art, in many cases, I ask myself a question I can't answer was, what does this tell me about the times?
Yeah.
And you got all that Impressionist art, which is in like the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
What does the Impression art in late 1800s tell you about the times?
Well, Impressionism was a pretty stark departure from realism. And I've always thought of it as a response to the invention of photography, at least in part. So prior to Impressionism, the purpose of art was to represent and to provide an accurate depiction of people. And we see that in society portraits. We see that in beautiful landscapes. And even if it wasn't strictly representing what was true, it was representing what we believed was realistic and perhaps aspirational at the time. With the invention of photography, we didn't really need to do that as much anymore. And people could use photography as a way to create what they believed or what they wanted people to believe was true about the world, to represent that. And so the Impressionists, I really see as responding to those shifts in technology and attempting instead to represent what is true to them emotionally and spiritually. To think about how the light interacts with the landscape, with the subject, to create something that is more than just what you would see, especially in a photograph. So Impressionism isn't strictly representational. And we see that especially in the evolution of Gauguin's style. So this early piece here, this is the earliest surviving painting that we have of Gauguin's. It was very deeply influenced by Camille Pissarro, who was, I'm saying that wrong, that's the Spanish way to say it, but who was one of his mentors. They painted alongside each other for many, many years. And you can see this is, it's a pretty typical, kind of boring, if you ask me, Impressionist landscape. It's really seeking to be fairly representational of what he would see in the countryside in France. Then if we look instead at his landscapes from Martinique, or from later when he was in Breton, we see a much more interesting, more creative, less realistic use of color and composition. So we can go, let's just skip back here and we'll talk about this one. So this is one of his better known paintings. He painted this right after returning from Martinique, and he was living, still sick, in Breton in a pension. This painting depicts both the actual, situation that would have arisen during a festival in the town he was living in, as well as kind of the imagined spiritual occurrence that was the impetus for this festival. So this is called the Vision After the Sermon. So it grew out of the town's Saints' Day. They would hold a big festival on the town's, the name day or the Saints' Day. And in this particular town, there was this sermon that would be given about Jacob wrestling the angel. And so everybody would gather around for an actual reenactment between two people of this wrestling match. But Gaugin wanted to paint, what was occurring on the spiritual plane through this reenactment. And so that's what this branch is representing, the division between the sacred and the profane, binaries again, categories that we really like to make. But again, they're like breaking down and creating this gray area that is this painting. And then he depicts these women over here praying about the angel wrestling with Jacob. He was incredibly proud of this. Oh, the branch, I'm sorry. He was borrowed from Japanese prints. He was a big collector of Japanese prints. He was very proud of this painting. Loved this painting, took it to the local church and said, look at what I made for you. Why don't you hang it up? It'll look great. It's going to provide a really interesting contrast between, the traditional architecture of the church and this very modern depiction of this this festival. And the priest was like, oh, no thank you. So poor Gaugin. He and all of his friends and disciples headed up the road and proposed it to another church further up the road, and they actually just took the liberty of hanging it up in the church without asking permission, which I thought, dang, that's pretty gutsy. Again, turned down, rejected. And he was just so downtrodden that this painting was not exhibited at all until his wife started selling off his paintings after he left her and the kids. So that was a little bit of a foray into it was why isn't it clicking? Did I not leave that one? There we go. Into Gauguin's attempts to kind of reconcile the physical and the spiritual and the emotional in his artwork. That was one of his great interests, and he felt that is really where culture arises from. Do we have time to talk about the family? I don't want to go over. Yes. Let's talk about the family. Oh my gosh, his poor family. So I was relating all of this to my husband, and he was like, I want to read the biography of the wife. I was like, well, yeah, good for you. Yeah, so do I. He was married to Mette Sophia Gad, who is a Danish woman, a little bit of a socialite. She was pretty well connected in Denmark, but she came to Paris with a friend and was introduced to Gaugin. He was really struck by her independence, so great. And really they did continue to live fairly independent lives once they were married and living in Paris. She was kind of known for her parties. Even after they moved to the artsy part of town, she was much more social than he was. He was introverted. She was the one that was gathering people together to socialize. They had 5 children together: Emile, Clovis, Aline, Jean-René, and Paula, whose real name is Paul, but he went by Paula to distinguish him from his father. In 1882, the stock market crashed, and he was not able to find a job in Paris, probably because he had been making friends with artists and not with folks in finance, and probably because he had been spending exorbitantly and rubbing his success in everybody's faces, and so they weren't terribly inclined to help him out. So Mette moved them to Copenhagen to stay with her family for a time. And Paul Gaugin was supposed to be selling tarpaulins during this time, but unfortunately he did not speak Danish, so that makes it really difficult to sell things to Danish people. Again, poor life choices combined with bad luck. So they're living with Mette's family, and he's miserable. She's pretty miserable. They move into their own apartments, and she starts a fairly successful business teaching French to Danish diplomats. And she's able to kind of pull on some strings, the connections that she had from earlier in her life before she met Gaugin. And she uses those connections connections and that income to support the family. She also becomes a fairly well-known and celebrated translator of French literature, which was up and coming in Denmark at the time, and so very popular, lots of demand for that, so good for Mette. Gaugin was miserable, did not speak Danish, moved back to Paris with their second son Clovis, and basically lived in poverty with his son for several months. And reading this was really difficult, actually, in the book, because I felt like, how on earth would you do that to your kid? Like, it was supposed to be helping his wife out, apparently, relieving some of the parental burden from her. But he is living in a one-room apartment with a single bed, no blankets, and he lets his son sleep on the bed, and he sleeps on the floor covered with a rug. And we know this from letters that he's writing back to Mette at the time, begging her to send money to help out. But they're eating, porridge daily. Eventually, he gets his sister to help support his son's move to a boarding school. So his son's situation improves, and he decides to head off to Breton. But throughout his entire life, his whole adulthood, basically, from 1882 to when he dies in 1903, he's the guy that's writing home to his wife saying, the next thing's gonna be my big break. I swear, the next thing is gonna make me rich. I'm gonna send you money any day now. Can you send me, another 100 francs in the meantime so I can pay my bills? And she really must have been a woman of incredible patience, or maybe she just, got fed up with it early on and didn't say as much. Lucky for her, though, she was left with an incredible collection of impressionist paintings that he had amassed through friendships and trades that he had in Paris. And so, unbeknownst to him, she was selling these off one by one in Denmark to support the family while he was absent. The letters and the journals that he left behind do suggest that he was thinking about his family, but the actions, of course, say otherwise. In spite of his profession to be want to be a good father, certainly there were other ways he could have gone about that than traveling the world, trying to make his art.
Are there any Tahitian?
Yes. Yes, so there's not a lot known about his Tahitian children. We do know that one of the sons became an artist also, so there are records of that. He had quite a few children aside from the ones that he had with Mette. He had one with another French woman, and there is a record of that person. I don't know that there are any descendants that are known. And then he had at least 3 other daughters in Tahiti for whom there are no records, but we know that they existed. Yes. Yes.
I'm recalling that throughout the 20th century, you had references to that Tahitian experience as something, it's almost like a colonizer's wet dream, where they're saying, if this happens in my life, if I lose everything, or if I get rich, that's where I want to be.
You want to go to Tahiti?
Right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes his work is referenced.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
So what is it about that?
The fantasy?
Yeah.
That's a really great segue into we can skip over this one. Let's get to this. Here's my last slide. I think you're onto something. There is this recurrent fantasy among people living in especially Europe and the United States of seeing the South Pacific, or perhaps the Caribbean, or perhaps anywhere that we deem as quote unquote less developed, as like the ideal place to go and retire. We see lots of folks going and retiring to places like Costa Rica because it's seen as like a higher ideal than we have in the United States. And that's not a new trend at all. And I think that Gaugin was kind of part of that trend too. He was looking for the ideal the ideal culture from which all culture sprang was kind of his thing. He wanted to find that primitive that was the root of everything else, to show partly that human beings were all one, is what Prideaux is arguing here. And that's not such a bad thing, right? I don't know, but we see this same sort of response to industrialization, to capitalist culture, I think, in young people in the United States who shove everything they own into a backpack and head off to South America. I was guilty of that at one time. We see it among anthropologists, especially, and I'm gonna ruffle some feathers perhaps and put a couple of photos next to each other. So here's Gaugin. He looks so creepy in this picture, doesn't he? Oh my gosh. Avoid. And anybody recognize this person? This is Margaret Mead. So early American anthropologist. She spent significant time in American Samoa, so not too far from French Polynesia. It's really interesting to me, throughout the text, Prideaux mentions that Gaugin felt like an outsider in Paris, especially in Copenhagen, but in Europe in general. And that was, started with his return from Peru and continued through adulthood. Whenever he would be mad at somebody as a kid, he would shout at them, "I am a savage from Peru!" And he didn't mean that as a bad thing. He was kind of asserting it as a badge of honor. And like I said earlier, he was constantly searching for that Peru of the mind, this idealized place that he could live and live out his dreams, honestly. And that was, I think, largely in response to the discomfort he felt moving back to France, living in Copenhagen, being in this extremely structured environment that required him to become a stockbroker in order to find success. I'm gonna put, this is maybe ruffling feathers too. At the time, also no, now we look at this and we're horrified, right? He was calling these people savages. That's terrible. He was also calling himself a savage. And I don't think that when he was saying it, it was a negative thing. He was reacting to colonial policies that were extremely demeaning, extremely oppressive, and he was observing the fallout of that among his neighbors while he was living in French Polynesia. And we know from his journals that he was acting as an advocate for them. Similarly, early anthropologists who had set off to parts unknown were reacting against the dominant science of the time that said that those folks aren't worth our time. They are undeveloped savages, they are lesser, we need to be working to bring them up to our level. They were pushing back against that. And they're saying, no, these cultures are worthy of knowing, worthy of study. And we should be celebrating them, we should be learning from them. And Mead especially, I think, was interested in finding a better alternative to what she saw in the United States. And her first book really illustrates that. She's extremely critical of US culture in the second half of that book. And she draws on her experiences in American Samoa to suggest that maybe we could all loosen up and be more like the Samoans. And to some extent, I think that Paul Gaugin was interested in doing the same things. He just didn't go about it in a very effective way. And I think I am out of time now. But I will say in the book, oh my goodness, she details this incredible conflict that he had ongoing with the priest in his village on Hivaoa. They hated each other. He was a thorn in that guy's side. He called his house the house of pleasure, which we generally take now as a gross, super gross. But at the time was meant kind of sarcastically as a jab at the priest, as a way of saying, like, loosen up, buddy, let go of some of these French norms that you are trying to impose on people here and just relax. And I think that that is an interesting take that Prideaux provides. Whether or not you believe it, of course, is up to you. Everybody has their own framing for these things and reasoning for doing so. Anyway, thank you very much. These are my rabbit holes. There's podcasts, there's this amazing interactive map that Yale has put together where you can like travel along with Gaugin and see the artwork attached to different places he lived. I would really recommend that. There's of course the Catalogue Raisonné that is available online, and you can take a look at that. And I've linked also some criticisms to the Art of Monstrous Men essay, as well as Let's Not Pretend Paul Gaugin was nice, he was a jerk.